The courthouse fell silent as Carol Alvarez raised her trembling finger, pointing past the 9 respectable suitors lined before the judge's bench. Her choice landed on the 10th man, the one who stood apart from the others, with his weathered hands and untamed dark hair that refused to lie flat despite his obvious attempts to tame it. Benjamin Howard's eyes widened in shock, his calloused fingers gripping the brim of his worn hat as a flush crept up his neck. The other men turned to stare, their faces a mixture of disbelief and indignation that she would choose the wild horse trainer over merchants and clerks and proper gentlemen. Judge Thompson's gavel struck the wooden block with finality. The sound echoed through the packed courtroom like a gunshot, sealing Carol's fate with a man she barely knew. A man whose only crime had been making her heart race every time their eyes met across the dusty streets of Cedar Falls. The murmur of the crowd rose like a tide, voices blending into a cacophony of judgment and speculation. Carol felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment about her scandalous choice. But when Benjamin stepped forward, his movements careful and deliberate, she saw something in his storm-gray eyes that made her believe she had chosen correctly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Carol descended into her new life, her hand resting lightly on Benjamin's offered arm. Behind them, the 9 rejected suitors filed out in various states of wounded pride and relief. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, leaving Carol to wonder how a simple inheritance dispute had led to this moment of choosing a husband from a lineup of strangers. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to claim her independence, she had been forced into the most dependent situation imaginable. 3 months earlier, Carol had arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing but a letter from a lawyer and the clothes on her back. The letter spoke of an uncle she'd never known, a man who had left her his ranch and a considerable sum of money with one peculiar stipulation. She had to be married within 6 months of his death, or the inheritance would pass to the town council for public works. It seemed like a cruel joke from beyond the grave, a final attempt by a lonely old man to ensure someone would carry on his name and tend his land. The Lazy S Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of prime grazing land, complete with a modest house, sturdy barns, and a herd of cattle that represented more wealth than Carol had ever imagined possessing. But the inheritance came with enemies. Jonathan Perez, the town's most influential banker, had expected to acquire the property through default when no heir appeared. His disappointment at Carol's arrival had quickly turned to schemes designed to ensure she would fail to meet the marriage requirement. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The first month in Cedar Falls had been a careful dance of courtship and calculation. Word spread quickly through the small community that the mysterious heir needed a husband, and suitors began appearing at her door with the regularity of clockwork. Jonathan Hernandez, the general store owner, brought her flowers and spoke earnestly about building a life together. Zachary Patel, the town's doctor, offered stability and respectability. Jacob Wood, the school teacher, quoted poetry and promised intellectual companionship. Each man presented himself as the logical choice, the safe choice, the choice that would secure her future and satisfy the community's expectations. They sat in her parlor, balancing teacups and speaking of practical matters like household management and social obligations. They were kind men, decent men, men who would treat her well and never cause scandal or gossip, but none of them made her pulse quicken or her breath catch in her throat. Benjamin Howard was different from the moment she first saw him. He worked with the wild horses that roamed the hills around Cedar Falls, gentling them with patience and understanding, rather than breaking their spirits through force. Carol had been walking through town when she heard the commotion in the corral behind the livery stable. A crowd had gathered to watch Benjamin work with a particularly stubborn Mustang, a beautiful black mare with fire in her eyes and rebellion in every line of her body. The horse reared and struck out with her front hooves, but Benjamin never flinched. He stood in the center of the corral, his voice low and steady as he spoke to the animal in tones too quiet for the spectators to hear. There was something almost magical in the way he moved, never rushing, never forcing, always giving the mare space to make her own choices. Carol found herself pressed against the fence rails, mesmerized by the dance between man and beast. When their eyes met across the corral, she felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with previous acquaintance. Benjamin's gaze held hers for a long moment before a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and Carol realized she was blushing furiously. The crowd around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat and the soft nickering of horses in the distance. She had fled then, embarrassed by her reaction and confused by the intensity of feelings she couldn't name. The second encounter came a week later at the general store. Carol was examining bolts of fabric when she heard a familiar voice asking about horse feed. She turned to see Benjamin speaking with Jonathan Hernandez, his hat in his hands and his dark hair falling across his forehead. He seemed different indoors, more contained, as if the walls made him uncomfortable. When he noticed her watching, that same slow smile spread across his face. Their conversation was brief and proper, centered on polite inquiries about her settling into town and his work with the horses. But underneath the surface pleasantries, Carol felt an electric current of attraction that left her hands trembling as she selected ribbons and thread. Benjamin's voice had a rough quality that spoke of wind and open spaces, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of honest work. There was nothing polished or refined about him, nothing that would impress the town's social arbiters, but something in his presence made Carol feel more alive than she had in months. The third meeting was no accident. Carol had taken to walking past the livery stable at the same time each evening, telling herself she was simply enjoying the fresh air and exercise. Benjamin seemed to understand her routine without discussion, timing his work to coincide with her appearances. They would nod politely to each other across the fence, exchange a few words about the weather or the horses, and part with the kind of lingering looks that spoke volumes. It was during one of these encounters that Benjamin's true nature revealed itself. A young boy had been teasing one of the horses, poking it with a stick and laughing at its distress. The animal, a gentle old gelding used for children's riding lessons, had nowhere to retreat in its small paddock. Benjamin appeared as if from nowhere, his usual calm demeanor replaced by controlled anger that was somehow more frightening than any shouting would have been. He knelt down to the boy's level, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made even Carol straighten her shoulders. He spoke about respect and kindness, about understanding that animals had feelings just like people. The boy, who had been defiant moments before, found himself nodding and apologizing without quite understanding how Benjamin had achieved such a transformation. When the child ran off to find his parents, Benjamin turned to the horse, running gentle hands over its neck and whispering the same soothing words Carol had heard him use with the wild Mustang. The incident revealed a depth of character that none of her other suitors possessed. Here was a man who understood power but chose gentleness, who could command respect without demanding it, who saw the world through eyes unclouded by social pretensions or material ambitions. Carol realized she was falling in love with a man she barely knew, a man whose very presence challenged everything she thought she wanted in a husband. As the weeks passed and the deadline for her marriage approached, the pressure from the community intensified. Jonathan Perez made increasingly pointed comments about the importance of choosing a husband who could properly manage such a substantial inheritance. The other suitors pressed their cases with growing urgency, each convinced that his practical advantages would eventually overcome any romantic notions she might harbor. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening when Carol discovered just how far some people would go to influence her decision. She had been returning from a visit to Elizabeth Walker, the preacher's wife, when she noticed light coming from the ranch house windows. Certain she had extinguished all the lamps before leaving, Carol approached cautiously, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and indignation. Inside, she found Jonathan Perez rifling through her uncle's desk, his expensive suit incongruous in the rustic setting. Papers were scattered across the floor, and several drawers hung open, their contents spilled carelessly about. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, his face cycled through surprise, guilt, and finally a calculating coldness that made Carol's blood run cold. The banker's explanation was smooth and practiced. He claimed to be looking for additional documents related to her uncle's will, papers that might clarify certain ambiguities in the inheritance terms. His tone suggested that Carol should be grateful for his diligence, that a woman alone couldn't possibly understand the complexities of such legal matters. But his eyes held a threat that his polite words couldn't disguise. Carol stood her ground, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She demanded that he leave immediately and warned him against any further uninvited visits. Jonathan's mask slipped then, revealing the calculating mind beneath the veneer of respectability. He spoke of her precarious position, of how quickly a woman's reputation could be destroyed in a small town, of how easily accidents could happen to someone living alone on an isolated ranch. The confrontation ended with Jonathan's departure, but not before he made his position clear. Carol had 2 weeks left to choose a husband, and if she continued to reject suitable candidates in favor of romantic fantasies, she might find herself with no options at all. The implication hung in the air like smoke, acrid and poisonous. Carol realized that her inheritance had made her not just wealthy, but vulnerable, a target for men who saw her as a means to an end, rather than a person deserving of respect and genuine affection. That night, sleep eluded Carol as she wrestled with the impossible situation. Every sound outside made her start. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The ranch that had represented freedom and independence now felt like a prison, its isolation a liability rather than an asset. She found herself thinking of Benjamin, of the quiet strength he had displayed with the frightened horse and the troublesome child. Would he stand by her if she chose him, or would he be overwhelmed by forces beyond his control? The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Samantha Thompson and Deborah Kim, two of the town's most respected matrons, arrived with covered dishes and concerned expressions. Their visit began pleasantly enough, with compliments on Carol's housekeeping and gentle inquiries about her adjustment to ranch life. But as the conversation progressed, their true purpose became clear. The women spoke in carefully modulated tones about the importance of making a sensible choice, of considering not just personal preferences, but community expectations. They painted vivid pictures of the social isolation that would follow an unsuitable marriage, the way doors would close and invitations would cease to arrive. Their words were wrapped in kindness, but the message was unmistakable. Choose correctly or face the consequences of defying social conventions. Samantha, her voice dripping with false sympathy, mentioned how difficult it must be for a young woman to make such an important decision without proper guidance. She suggested that perhaps Carol would benefit from the wisdom of more experienced individuals, people who understood the delicate balance of small-town politics and social hierarchies. The offer of help came with strings attached, invisible but binding nonetheless. Deborah took a different approach, focusing on the practical aspects of marriage and ranch management. She spoke knowledgeably about cattle prices and land values, about the importance of choosing a husband who could navigate the complex world of agricultural business. Her subtle dismissal of Benjamin's qualifications was delivered with surgical precision, cutting away at Carol's confidence without ever crossing the line into outright insult. The visit left Carol feeling more isolated than ever. Even the women of the town, who should have been her natural allies, were arrayed against her unconventional choice. She began to understand that her decision would affect not just her own future, but Benjamin's as well. By choosing him, she would be subjecting him to the same social ostracism that awaited her. The crisis came to a head 3 days before the deadline, when Carol discovered that her cattle had been rustled. She woke to find the pastures empty and the gate to the main corral standing open. The loss represented not just a significant portion of her wealth, but a direct attack on her ability to maintain the ranch independently. Without the cattle, the land would be nearly worthless, making her inheritance a hollow victory, even if she managed to marry within the required time frame. Carol's first instinct was to ride to town and report the theft to the sheriff, but a note left on her kitchen table made her reconsider. The message was brief and unsigned, but its meaning was crystal clear. The cattle would be returned if she made the right choice in a husband, continue down her current path, and she would find that rustling was only the beginning of her troubles. The implications were staggering. Someone with significant resources and influence was orchestrating a campaign designed to force her hand. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, the execution too smooth to be the work of common thieves. Carol realized that she was facing an enemy with far more power than she had imagined, someone who could manipulate events from the shadows while maintaining a facade of respectability. As she stood in her empty pastures, watching the morning sun illuminate the trampled grass where her cattle had grazed, Carol felt the full weight of her isolation. The other suitors would see this setback as an opportunity to press their advantages, offering protection and security in exchange for her hand. They would present themselves as knights in shining armor, riding to the rescue of a damsel in distress. The narrative was so perfect, so socially acceptable, that few would question the convenient timing of her misfortune. But Carol had learned to read between the lines of small-town politics. The men who offered protection were likely the same ones who had created the need for it. They had engineered her vulnerability to enhance their own value as potential husbands. The realization filled her with a cold fury that burned away the last of her uncertainty about Benjamin Howard. She found him at the livery stable, working with a young colt that showed promise but lacked discipline. Benjamin looked up as she approached, and something in her expression made him set aside his training rope and give her his full attention. Carol told him about the missing cattle and the threatening note, watching his face carefully for any sign of surprise or guilt. What she saw instead was a slow-burning anger that matched her own. Benjamin's response was immediate and decisive. He would help her track the stolen herd, using skills learned from years of working with wild horses in rough country. He didn't offer empty reassurances or promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he simply stated that they would find her cattle and bring them home. The quiet confidence in his voice did more to calm Carol's fears than any amount of flowery rhetoric could have accomplished. They rode out together as the sun climbed toward its zenith, following the trail left by the rustlers through skill and patience rather than haste. Benjamin proved to be an excellent tracker, reading signs in the disturbed earth that Carol would never have noticed. He moved through the landscape like he belonged there, his connection to the natural world evident in every gesture and decision. The trail led them into the hills north of town, through country that grew increasingly wild and remote with each passing mile. Carol had never ventured so far from the ranch alone, and she found herself grateful for Benjamin's steady presence beside her. He seemed to anticipate dangers before they materialized, guiding them around unstable ground and away from areas where they might be easily ambushed. As they rode, Benjamin began to talk about his life in a way he never had before. He spoke of growing up on a small farm, of learning to work with horses from his grandfather, of the years he had spent drifting from place to place before settling in Cedar Falls. His words painted a picture of a man who had chosen his path deliberately, who valued freedom and independence above social acceptance or material gain. The stolen cattle were hidden in a box canyon 20 miles from town, guarded by two men who clearly hadn't expected anyone to track them so quickly. Benjamin studied the situation with the same careful attention he brought to training horses, looking for the safest way to recover the herd without triggering a confrontation that could turn deadly. His plan was simple but required perfect timing and absolute trust between him and Carol. They waited until dusk, when the guards would be less alert and the fading light would provide cover for their approach. Benjamin would circle around to the far end of the canyon while Carol created a distraction at the mouth. It was dangerous, relying on split-second timing and the hope that the rustlers would be more interested in escaping than fighting. But it was their best chance of recovering the cattle without bloodshed. The plan worked better than Carol had dared hope. When she appeared at the canyon entrance, calling out in a voice that carried just the right note of confused concern, the guards rushed toward her with their weapons drawn. They expected to find a lost woman, easily intimidated and quickly silenced. Instead, they found themselves facing someone who had learned to project strength even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. While the rustlers focused on Carol, Benjamin drove the cattle toward the canyon mouth with the skill of someone who understood herd behavior instinctively. The animals, already nervous from their confinement, responded to his guidance with an eagerness that spoke of their desire to return home. By the time the guards realized what was happening, the entire herd was streaming past them toward open ground. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. One of the rustlers, a man Carol recognized as working for Jonathan Perez, raised his rifle with clear intent to shoot. Benjamin appeared as if from nowhere, tackling the man and sending his weapon spinning into the darkness. The fight was over quickly, but not before Carol saw a side of Benjamin she had only glimpsed before. When protecting something he cared about, the gentle horse trainer became something altogether more formidable. They drove the cattle home through the night, taking turns watching for pursuit that never came. The rustlers had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, choosing to disappear rather than risk further confrontation. But Carol knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The forces arrayed against her would regroup and try again, using different tactics but pursuing the same goal. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Carol felt a profound shift in her understanding of what she wanted from life. The night's adventure had stripped away the last of her illusions about the nature of her situation. She was not a helpless woman in need of rescue, but a capable person who could face danger and emerge stronger. And Benjamin was not just a potential husband, but a true partner, someone who would stand with her against whatever challenges the future might bring. The revelation came with a sense of rightness that surprised Carol with its intensity. She had been so focused on the practical aspects of choosing a husband that she had nearly missed the most important consideration of all. Love, real love, was not about security or social status or even compatibility of interests. It was about finding someone who saw the world through eyes that complemented your own, someone who made you want to be the best version of yourself. Standing in her kitchen as Benjamin tended to the horses they had ridden hard through the night, Carol made her decision. The deadline was still 2 days away, but she no longer needed the time to consider her options. She would choose Benjamin Howard not because he was the safe choice or the practical choice, but because he was the only choice that made her heart sing with possibility. The announcement of her decision sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls. The other suitors reacted with varying degrees of disappointment and outrage, their carefully laid plans crumbling in the face of her unexpected choice. Jonathan Perez's fury was particularly intense, though he was careful to mask it behind a facade of concerned disappointment. He spoke publicly about the tragedy of a young woman making such an imprudent decision, but his eyes promised retribution. The wedding preparations began immediately, driven by the approaching deadline and the need to satisfy the legal requirements of the inheritance. Elizabeth Walker, the preacher's wife, threw herself into the planning with an enthusiasm that surprised Carol. Despite the social pressure to disapprove of the match, Elizabeth seemed genuinely pleased by Carol's choice. She had observed Benjamin's character over the years and found it worthy of respect. Karen Brown, the town's seamstress, worked tirelessly to create a wedding dress worthy of the occasion. Her skilled fingers transformed simple fabric into something beautiful and elegant, proving that style and sophistication didn't require vast sums of money. The dress was a testament to the power of creativity and determination, qualities that Carol was learning to value above material wealth. But not everyone in town was supportive of the upcoming nuptials. The pressure campaign against Carol and Benjamin intensified as the wedding date approached. Suppliers began refusing to sell goods to the ranch, claiming shortages that mysteriously didn't affect other customers. Social invitations ceased to arrive, and former acquaintances crossed the street rather than acknowledge Carol's presence. Benjamin faced his own challenges as word of the engagement spread. His work with horses had always been respected, even by those who considered him socially unsuitable, but now even that began to dry up. Clients canceled contracts and found excuses to avoid doing business with him. The message was clear. Association with Carol Alvarez came at a significant cost. The isolation might have broken a weaker couple, but it only strengthened the bond between Carol and Benjamin. They discovered that adversity had a way of revealing true character, both in themselves and in others. The people who stood by them during this difficult time proved themselves to be genuine friends, while those who abandoned them revealed the shallow nature of their previous support. 3 days before the wedding, the situation escalated beyond social pressure and economic intimidation. Carol woke to find her barn on fire, the flames already consuming the structure that housed her tools and feed supplies. The volunteer fire brigade responded quickly, but their efforts seemed half-hearted, as if they were going through the motions rather than fighting the blaze with genuine urgency. Benjamin arrived as the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. His face was grim as he surveyed the damage, calculating the cost not just in terms of money, but in terms of the message being sent. This was no accident, no careless spark from a discarded cigarette. Someone had deliberately set the fire, escalating the campaign against Carol to include outright destruction of property. The sheriff's investigation was perfunctory at best. He asked a few questions, made notes in a small book, and promised to look into the matter. But his tone suggested that he considered the fire a regrettable but not entirely surprising consequence of Carol's poor judgment in choosing a husband. The implication was that she had brought this trouble on herself and could expect more of the same if she continued down her current path. That night, Benjamin insisted on staying at the ranch to watch for further trouble. They sat on the front porch as darkness fell, listening to the sounds of the night and watching for any sign of unwelcome visitors. The conversation that developed between them was unlike any they had shared before, stripped of pretense and social convention by the gravity of their situation. Benjamin spoke about his fears, not for himself but for Carol. He had faced hostility and rejection before, but he had never been responsible for someone else's safety and happiness. The weight of that responsibility was sobering, forcing him to consider whether his love for Carol was worth the dangers it brought to her life. His honesty was both heartbreaking and inspiring, revealing a depth of feeling that went far beyond simple attraction. Carol's response came from the heart, unfiltered by the careful considerations that had governed her behavior since arriving in Cedar Falls. She spoke of her loneliness before meeting him, of the emptiness that had characterized her life despite its outward respectability. Benjamin had awakened something in her that she hadn't even known was sleeping, a capacity for joy and passion that transformed every ordinary moment into something precious. The final confrontation came on the morning of the wedding. Carol was dressing in her new gown when she heard horses approaching the ranch at a gallop. Through her bedroom window, she saw Jonathan Perez leading a group of men toward the house, their faces set with grim determination. The banker's mask of civility had finally slipped completely, revealing the ruthless ambition that had always lurked beneath the surface. Benjamin met them in the front yard, his stance relaxed but ready. He had faced down wild horses and angry men before, but never with so much at stake. Behind him, the ranch house represented not just Carol's inheritance, but their future together, their chance at the kind of life that most people only dreamed about. He would not let it be taken without a fight. The confrontation began with accusations and threats thinly disguised as legal concerns. Jonathan claimed to have discovered irregularities in the inheritance documents, technicalities that would invalidate Carol's claim to the property. His tone was reasonable, almost regretful, as he explained that the wedding would have to be postponed pending a thorough investigation of these newly discovered issues. But Benjamin had learned to read men as carefully as he read horses, and he recognized the deception immediately. The papers Jonathan flourished were forgeries, created to provide legal cover for what was essentially theft. The banker was gambling that Carol would be too intimidated to challenge his claims, that she would surrender her inheritance rather than face a prolonged legal battle she couldn't afford to fight. Carol appeared in the doorway at that moment, resplendent in her wedding dress, but with fire in her eyes that made even the hardened men behind Jonathan take a step back. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening, and her response was swift and decisive. She demanded to see the original documents, to have them examined by an independent authority, to have every claim verified through proper legal channels. The banker's composure cracked under her steady gaze and unwavering demands. He had expected to find a frightened woman, easily bullied into submission. Instead, he faced someone who had been transformed by love and adversity into a formidable opponent. The months of pressure and intimidation had not broken Carol Alvarez. They had forged her into something stronger than she had ever been before. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of unexpected allies. Judge Thompson rode into the yard accompanied by the sheriff and several prominent citizens who had grown uncomfortable with the increasingly obvious campaign against Carol. The judge's presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation, introducing legal authority that even Jonathan Perez couldn't ignore. What followed was a thorough examination of all claims and counterclaims, conducted in the harsh light of day, with witnesses present to ensure fairness. The forged documents were exposed for what they were, the intimidation campaign was laid bare, and the true nature of the opposition to Carol's marriage was revealed. Jonathan's carefully constructed facade crumbled under scrutiny, leaving him exposed as a man willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Carol's inheritance was legitimate, her right to choose her own husband was absolute, and any further interference would be met with the full force of the law. The men who had ridden out to the ranch with such confidence found themselves facing potential charges for their actions, their future suddenly uncertain in ways they had never imagined. As the defeated conspirators rode away, Carol and Benjamin stood together on the porch where they had shared so many meaningful conversations. The immediate danger had passed, but they both understood that the victory came with costs that would echo through their lives for years to come. They had made enemies who would not forget or forgive, allies who might prove unreliable when tested, and a community that remained divided about the wisdom of their choice. But they also had each other, and that made all the difference. The love that had grown between them during the months of courtship and crisis had been tested in ways that most couples never experienced. They had seen each other at their worst and best, had faced genuine danger together, had made choices that revealed the true content of their characters. The wedding ceremony took place that afternoon in the small church at the heart of Cedar Falls. The guest list was shorter than Carol had originally planned, reduced by the social pressures that had driven away fair-weather friends and revealed the true nature of others. But those who came did so with genuine joy and support, creating an atmosphere of celebration that more than compensated for the smaller numbers. Elizabeth Walker had decorated the church with wildflowers gathered from the hills around town, their simple beauty more appropriate to the occasion than expensive arrangements would have been. The flowers spoke of the natural world that Benjamin loved, of the untamed beauty that had first drawn Carol to him, of the life they would build together away from the artificial constraints of social convention. Benjamin stood at the altar in his best suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, but his eyes holding all the wildness that had first attracted Carol's attention. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothing, but his discomfort disappeared the moment Carol appeared in the church doorway. The transformation in his expression was visible to everyone present, a look of wonder and gratitude that spoke more eloquently than any wedding vows could. Carol's walk down the aisle was a journey through months of growth and discovery. Each step carried her further from the uncertain woman who had arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing but a lawyer's letter, and closer to the confident person she had become through love and adversity. The wedding dress that Karen Brown had created moved with her like a second skin, beautiful but not ostentatious, elegant but practical enough for the life she was choosing. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, conducted by Pastor Williams with words that emphasized partnership and mutual support, rather than traditional notions of submission and dominance. The vows that Carol and Benjamin exchanged were personal and heartfelt, speaking of their commitment to face whatever challenges the future might bring as equals and partners. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender but passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, their enthusiasm genuine despite the smaller numbers. These were people who had chosen to stand with Carol and Benjamin despite social pressure and potential consequences, and their support meant more than any grand gesture from those who had abandoned them. The reception was held at the ranch, transformed for the occasion into a place of celebration and joy. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by friends and neighbors who had refused to be intimidated by the campaign against the couple. The food was simple but delicious, prepared with love and served with genuine warmth that no amount of money could have purchased. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills that surrounded the ranch, Carol found herself standing with Benjamin on the same porch, where they had faced down their enemies just hours before. The contrast was striking. The same location transformed from a place of confrontation to one of peaceful celebration. It seemed symbolic of their entire relationship, built on the foundation of shared challenges and strengthened by their ability to face adversity together. The guests began to depart as darkness fell, leaving the newlyweds alone with the ranch that had brought them together and the future that stretched out before them like an uncharted territory. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last of the carriages disappear down the dusty road that connected their property to the outside world. Benjamin's arm around Carol's waist felt natural and right, as if they had been standing together like this for years rather than hours. The challenges they had faced during their courtship had accelerated their relationship in ways that normal circumstances never could have. creating a bond that felt unbreakable despite its relatively recent formation. The months that followed their wedding brought both challenges and rewards that neither Carol nor Benjamin had fully anticipated. The social ostracism they faced was real but not absolute, creating a smaller but more genuine circle of friends and associates. Those who stood by them proved to be people of substance and character, while those who abandoned them revealed themselves to be fair-weather allies, not worth mourning. The ranch prospered under their joint management, combining Carol's business acumen with Benjamin's understanding of animals and land. They discovered that their different backgrounds and skills complemented each other perfectly, creating a partnership that was stronger than either could have achieved alone. The cattle herd grew, the pastures were improved, and the ranch buildings were expanded to accommodate their growing success. Benjamin's work with horses evolved from simple training to something approaching artistry. His reputation spread beyond Cedar Falls, attracting clients from distant towns who were willing to travel significant distances to work with someone who understood horses so completely. The irony was not lost on Carol that the very qualities that had made Benjamin socially unacceptable had also made him professionally invaluable. The relationship between Carol and Benjamin deepened with each passing season. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences, developed private jokes and shared memories, created traditions that were uniquely their own. The physical attraction that had first drawn them together was complemented by intellectual compatibility and emotional intimacy that grew stronger with time. Their first anniversary was celebrated quietly, with just the two of them in a simple dinner prepared together in their kitchen. The contrast with their wedding day was deliberate, emphasizing the private nature of their happiness rather than seeking public validation. They had learned that the opinions of others mattered far less than their own contentment and mutual respect. The arrival of their first child 2 years after their marriage marked another milestone in their journey together. Samantha Thompson, despite her earlier reservations about their match, proved to be an invaluable source of advice and support during Carol's pregnancy and the early months of motherhood. The baby, a daughter they named Sarah, became a bridge between Carol and some of the women in town who had previously held themselves apart. Benjamin's transformation into a father was remarkable to witness. The same patience and gentleness he showed with horses extended naturally to his daughter, creating a bond that was evident from her earliest days. He would spend hours holding her, speaking in the same soft tones he used with frightened animals, his face transformed by a wonder that never seemed to fade. The ranch became a different place with a child in residence. The sounds of laughter and play joined the lowing of cattle and the nickering of horses in the daily symphony of their lives. Carol discovered that motherhood suited her in ways she had never expected, bringing out protective instincts and depths of love she hadn't known she possessed. As Sarah grew from infant to toddler, she showed signs of inheriting both her parents' best qualities. She had Carol's determination and intelligence combined with Benjamin's intuitive understanding of animals and the natural world. Watching her take her first steps across the ranch yard, Carol felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with property or inheritance, and everything to do with the family they had created together. The challenges of their early marriage had given way to the different but equally rewarding challenges of building a life together. They faced droughts and good seasons, sick animals and healthy births, financial pressures and unexpected windfalls with the same partnership that had seen them through their courtship. Each obstacle overcome together strengthened their bond and increased their confidence in their ability to handle whatever the future might bring. The vindication of Carol's choice came gradually but unmistakably as the years passed. The ranch's success spoke for itself, becoming one of the most prosperous operations in the region through the combination of hard work, intelligent management, and the kind of partnership that multiplied rather than simply added their individual strengths. Benjamin's reputation as a horse trainer brought clients from across the territory, while Carol's business skills ensured that their success translated into lasting prosperity. The social acceptance that had been withheld during their courtship began to return as the community witnessed the obvious happiness and success of their marriage. Former critics found themselves forced to acknowledge that Carol had chosen wisely, that the wild horse trainer had proven himself to be not just a capable husband, but an asset to the entire community. The transformation was slow but steady, marked by small gestures and gradual inclusion in social activities. Jonathan Perez's fall from grace was as dramatic as Carol and Benjamin's rise to respectability. His involvement in the campaign against their marriage had damaged his reputation beyond repair once the truth became known. Business associates began to question his integrity, clients moved their accounts to other institutions, and he found himself increasingly isolated in a community that valued honesty and fair dealing above social pretensions. The banker's eventual departure from Cedar Falls was accomplished quietly, without fanfare or public acknowledgement of his failures. He simply closed his affairs and moved to a distant city where his reputation hadn't preceded him. His absence was noted but not mourned, a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing ambition to override decency and fairness. Elizabeth Walker became one of Carol and Benjamin's closest friends, her initial support during their courtship blossoming into a deep and lasting friendship. The preacher's wife had always been a keen judge of character, and her early recognition of Benjamin's worth was vindicated by his subsequent behavior as husband and father. She became Sarah's unofficial grandmother, showering the child with the kind of attention that enriched her development in countless ways. The other suitors who had competed for Carol's hand found their own paths to happiness, though none achieved the kind of profound contentment that characterized the Howard marriage. Some married for practical reasons and found satisfaction in stable, if unpassionate, unions, while others remained bachelors, perhaps recognizing that they had witnessed something rare and being unwilling to settle for less. Zachary Patel, the doctor who had courted Carol with earnest determination, eventually married Karen Brown, the seamstress who had created Carol's wedding dress. Their union was based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than grand passion, but it proved to be solid and enduring. They often remarked that watching Carol and Benjamin's relationship had taught them valuable lessons about the importance of genuine compatibility over surface attractions. Jacob Wood, the school teacher who had quoted poetry during his courtship, found his calling in education rather than marriage. He became the principal of Cedar Falls' expanding school system, his bachelor status allowing him to dedicate himself completely to the intellectual development of the town's children. He remained a friend to both Carol and Benjamin, his initial disappointment transforming into genuine respect for their happiness. The ranch continued to grow and prosper, becoming a model operation that other ranchers studied and emulated. Benjamin's innovations in horse training were adopted throughout the region, while Carol's business practices became the standard by which other operations measured their success. Their partnership had created something greater than the sum of its parts, a legacy that would endure long after their own lives had ended. As Sarah grew into a confident and capable young woman, she embodied the best qualities of both her parents while developing her own unique strengths and interests. She showed an aptitude for both the practical aspects of ranch management and the more artistic elements of horse training, suggesting that the family traditions would continue into the next generation with fresh perspectives and new innovations. Standing on the porch of their expanded ranch house 15 years after their wedding, Carol and Benjamin watched their daughter work with a young colt in the training corral. Sarah moved with the same patient confidence that had first attracted Carol to her father, but her techniques showed innovations that were uniquely her own. The next generation was already improving on the foundations they had laid, carrying their legacy forward in ways they could never have imagined. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully. The ranch had become everything Carol's uncle had envisioned when he crafted his unusual will, a thriving operation that served as the foundation for a strong and loving family. His requirement that she marry within 6 months had seemed cruel at the time, but it had ultimately led her to a happiness she could never have found on her own. Benjamin's arm around her shoulders felt as natural and right as it had on their wedding day, the passage of years having deepened rather than diminished the connection between them. They had faced challenges that would have broken weaker partnerships, overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable, and built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of social disapproval and economic pressure. The wild horse trainer who had made her blush across a corral fence had become so much more than she had dared to hope. He was her partner in every sense of the word, her closest friend, her most trusted advisor, and the father of her child. The qualities that had made him unsuitable in the eyes of Cedar Falls society had proven to be exactly what she needed to build the life she had always wanted without knowing it. Carol reflected on the moment in the courthouse when she had pointed past 9 respectable suitors to choose the one man who had made her heart race. It had seemed like such a risk at the time, a leap of faith based on nothing more than intuition and attraction. But it had proven to be the wisest decision of her life, the choice that had opened the door to everything that followed. The sound of Sarah's laughter drifted across the yard as the colt responded to her guidance with obvious trust and affection. The young woman had inherited her parents' gift for understanding animals, but she had also developed her own unique approach that combined traditional techniques with innovative methods. She represented the future of the ranch and the continuation of the values that Carol and Benjamin had worked so hard to establish. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Carol felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The inheritance that had seemed like such a burden had become the foundation for the greatest blessing of her life. The requirement to marry a stranger had led her to the love of her life. The social pressure and economic intimidation had forged her into someone stronger and more confident than she had ever imagined possible. Benjamin's voice was soft in the darkness as he spoke of his own gratitude for the day she had chosen him over all the other suitors. He had never expected to find someone who would see past his rough exterior to the man beneath, someone who would value his skills and character over social status and financial security. Carol had given him not just love, but the chance to become the best version of himself. Their story had become legend in Cedar Falls, told and retold as an example of the power of following one's heart, despite social pressure and practical considerations. Young couples facing their own challenges often sought their advice, drawn by the obvious happiness and success of their marriage. Carol and Benjamin were always generous with their time and wisdom, understanding that their own happiness had been built partly on the support of others during their darkest moments. The ranch would continue to thrive under Sarah's eventual management, the traditions they had established evolving to meet the challenges of changing times while maintaining the core values that had made their success possible. The love story that had begun with a pointing finger in a courthouse had become something larger than themselves, a testament to the power of courage, determination, and the willingness to choose love over security. In the end, Carol Alvarez had not just chosen a husband from 10 men. She had chosen a life of purpose, passion, and profound contentment that would echo through generations yet to come.